Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be finally doing a video which I have been promising for a very long time, a topic which is very, very close to my heart. It's a guide to Russian names, pronunciation, and transliteration. This is going to be based off of several blog posts which I have done over the years, as well as the front matter, a guide to Russian names and pronunciation, which I always include in my novels with Russian characters. And, you know, it has to be said, unfortunately, being a Russophile does not mean I in any way support Tsar Vladimir's genocidal war against the Ukrainian people, nor does it mean I supported the absolutely blatant, disgusting favoritism towards Russian ice skaters before they were thankfully banned from international competition. So anyway, let's just get down with it. I have heard a lot of non-Russophile Westerners complaining that Russian names are too complicated, long, annoying, or confusing for them. I have never felt confused or annoyed by Russian naming customs, but then again, I've been reading Russian literature since I was a teen. I immediately got the hang of patronymics and nicknames, and that it's common for one person to be called by multiple names. Like, seriously, I even saw one person here on BookTube recently saying, oh, it's so annoying and confusing, like translators should just leave out patronymics and all these nicknames for the benefit of English speakers because I'm just so annoyed and angry and confused by their existence. Like, seriously, that's an established part of their language, their naming customs, their onomastic culture, and you're just saying, oh, because I, as an English speaker, am so unfamiliar with it, and I can't take more than 1 minute to figure out how they work. It should be totally left out, and therefore everyone should find it annoying and confusing. And there was one book I DNF'd a while ago. Hopefully I will do some videos, one video in future based on 2 blog posts I wrote about it. The author actually had the audacity to say in her note at the back, oh, Russian names sound all the same, and I find them damnably confusing. So therefore, I made up nicknames for a bunch of real-life characters. Like, seriously, that's just so culturally insensitive. Russian surnames differ by the sex of the bearer, which is also known as grammatical gender. A woman's name will end in A, and obviously the man's name doesn't, and ski becomes skaya for a woman. Occasionally, you'll see a surname that doesn't end in the common ova, ava, yeva, ina, kina, or ski, skaya. These tend to be imports, obviously, from neighboring cultures that assimilated into Russian families through marriage, like, for example, names of German or Ukrainian origin. The German Baltic nobility, they were big in Russia, particularly during the years of the Russian Empire, and obviously because Russia shares a border with Belarus and Ukraine and a bunch of other places, they would sometimes come into Russia to live, or they would, vice versa, and they would get married, and obviously the names would come into a family that way. If you see a name that ends in enko or ko, you obviously know it's Ukrainian. There are obviously a bunch of other common surnames like ik, ak, yuk, yak, like chuk, chak, things like that for Belarusian surnames, and also Ukrainian surnames a bit. And there are also a few Russian surnames that look like patronymics, such as Kuzmich. The patronymic, the otchestvo, is derived from your father's name. If it ends in a consonant like Ivan, Fyodor, or Boris, the ending will be ovna or ovich. If it ends in a Y, like Nikolai, Vasily, or Valery, the ending is Yevna or Yevich. A few names take differing forms when made into patronymics. For example, Pyotr becomes Petrovich and Petrovna, Pavel becomes Pavlovich and Pavlovna, Lev becomes Lvovich and Lvovna, Mikhail becomes Mikhailovich and Mikhailovna, and unfortunately, many people, they just don't correctly transliterate the patronymics that come from Mikhail. They just render the last vowel in the name as an I instead of a Y. It actually does turn into a Y in the patronymic form of that name, but many people, unfortunately, they just don't know that for whatever reason. And the rare Russian male name that ends in a vowel will have its own set of rules for patronymics. For example, Ilya becomes Ilyich and Ilyinichna, and Kuzma becomes Kuzmich and Kuzminichna. It's just really, really not common to find a Russian name for a male ending in a vowel. Like, off the top of my head, one of the other ones I can think of is Foma, which is the Russian form of Thomas. And sometimes a man, usually older, will be called by his patronymic alone, or a shortened form of it. For example, Ivanovich becomes Ivanich, Andreyevich becomes Andrich. However, this takes years, often decades, of friendship and conveys respect, affection, and playfulness. It's not a form of address you'd ever use with someone you've just met. In my Russian novel, You Cannot Kill a Swan, at one point, fairly early on, the character Ginny, he's really trying to annoy Ivan, get on his nerves, disrespect him, and so he calls him by his patronymic, and then he makes it even worse by calling him by a shortened form of it. That's just totally chutzpahdik. You absolutely do not do that to a man ever. And there are also some nickname forms of the first name you also do not want to use lightly, particularly not with someone you've just met or you don't have that kind of like fond, friendly, intimate relationship with. You always call someone by his or her first name and patronymic, never the first name alone, unless you're addressing a child, or perhaps you're at a social event with people of your same age. After you know the person well enough, you may be invited to switch to first names only. A nickname is never used with a patronymic. It's like makes me cringe so much when I see that in books. I just saw that recently. I was mentioning them, The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights by Kitty Zeldis, which I actually enjoyed a fair bit more than I did her first book, Not Our Kind. I was thinking of doing a video of it. Maybe I'll do a video about it in future. But anyway, there was at one point when a character in one of the flashback chapters is called Vova Andreyovich. That, and even the patronymic, that was not a Russian patronymic at all. It sounded like it wanted to be a Ukrainian patronymic because of the slightly different ending, but it wasn't spelled the way a Ukrainian name or patronymic form would be spelled. So what was up with that? That was just so weird. Someone totally did not do her research, and do Big Five publishing houses even employ fact checkers anymore? Often, you can tell what the root of a basic nickname form is if you know Russian names well, but others aren't so easy to decipher. Generally, part of the name has sha or ya added to the end of it, or sometimes ushka, yushka, olchka, or ik. Occasionally, an e will become a yo in a nickname, and vice versa. And if a name ends in Slav, Slava, like Rostislav, Miroslava, Mistislav, or Yaroslava, one of the nicknames will be Slava. If you know a person very well, it's okay to use a superdiminutive form like Echka, Yechka, Yenka, Enka, Yushenka, Ulia, Yulia, or Onka. However, you never use a very familiar nickname with someone you don't know very well, not even with a child. With a child, you should start out using the common nickname. Like, for example, you'll begin calling the little boy Misha, and eventually, if you get to know him well enough and his family approves or he likes you enough, you might be invited to start calling him Mishenka. You also want to tread carefully with the ka ending, since it implies different things depending on your relationship. If Vasily's wife or mother calls him Vaska, it's assumed to be in a loving way. If someone he doesn't know or like very well calls him Vaska, it's usually meant disrespectfully. Russian names generally fall into the following categories. Native Slavic names, such as Rostislav, Vyacheslav, Vasivolod, Svetlana, Radoslava, and Lyubov. Names adapted from Greek and Russianized due to the original union of Orthodox Christianity, such as Spiridon, Mitri, Pelagia, and Yevpraxia. Names adopted from surrounding cultures and Russianized, such as Carla, Clara, and Clarissa. The invented names most popular in the first decades of the Soviet Union, such as Milor, Novomira, Dotnara, Vilen, Vladlena, and Ninel. And as far as I'm aware of, Ninel, which is obviously the name Lenin backwards, seems to have been the most popular one. It stuck around a lot longer after many of the other invented names, which were so popular in the first, I think, maybe 3-4-ish decades or so of the USSR. They kind of fell from favor. Not many people were still interested in them. The transliteration style, which I've been using for many years, is the modern letter for style. For example, I would write the name Yuri as Y-U-R-I-Y instead of Y-U-R-Y or Y-U-R-I, or the nickname Katya I would write as K-A-T-Y-A instead of K-A-T-I-A, and the name Alexander I would write with a K and ending with a DR instead of the Alexander, the familiar English spelling with an accent, and just a bunch of things like that. Or I would add a Y-Y-A instead of just an I-A at the names like Anastasia and Maria, and just basically things like that. The letters A and I are always long, and O is pronounced like a long A when unstressed. So, for example, Ivan, the name I-V-A-N is Ivan, and Boris, B-O-R-I-S, is Boris. G is always hard. For example, Georgia instead of Georgia or Georgia, and the letter KH is like the guttural and the CH in Locke or Hanukkah. In the case of the surnames Gorbachova and Likachova, the letter E with an umlaut over it is left as is instead of transliterated, as it usually is, as Y-O, yo, for the reason that the spellings Gorbachova and Likachova would look awkward. Seriously, even I'm not that pedantic and pretentious. Though the titles Mr. and Mrs. and Miss are extremely unusual in Russian, or at least in modern Russian for a very long time, in my books I use those titles to distinguish the older characters from the younger characters in a way that's familiar to the non-Russian or Russophile reader. Like generally they would be addressed in the first name in patronymic style if they were actually, in Russia. But in the old, very, very old days, at least as far as I've, to my understanding, they did sometimes use like Mr. and Mrs. or Russian equivalents more often. So it's not, completely anachronistic. And sometimes you do have to make a few, compromises for the sake of your audience. I personally use letter-by-letter transliteration from Cyrillic, except in cases where exact transliteration looks awkward and weird. Even my nitpickiness and pretentiousness has limits. For example, Ukraine's capital truly transliterates as K-Y-Y-I-V, but I use the official transliteration preferred by the Ukrainian people, K-Y-I-V. I also don't render soft and hard signs with apostrophes, since even I think that's nitpicky. Off the top of my head, the name Olga comes to mind. There's I believe a soft sign after the letter Ol, and it indicates you have to roll the L, so it's pronounced more like Olga. And there's also a soft sign after the T in Tatiana, so it indicates you kind of say it more like Tatiana. Different people have different transliteration styles, and I can live with a style that's not my own, so long as it's consistent. However, some styles seem more old-fashioned than others, like translating certain names or translating names of royalty. I understand certain people are much better known by Anglo names in the English-speaking world, like Peter the Great and Nicholas II, but it's really arrogant and Anglo-centric to use names like Serge, Elizabeth, Michael, Marie, and Eugene for people who were only ever called by Russian names. Like, seriously, you're so out of date. At least 30 years out of date if you're still doing that. I've encountered some books written by this team. They write several books about Russian history. People have various opinions on, their exact historical accuracy and such like that. But it really gets in my craw. They seriously translate everybody's name. It's just so freaking goofy. They even call the writer Gogol Nicholas Gogol. Seriously, or they were referring to a Ukrainian architect as Anthony instead of Anton. Seriously, how culturally insensitive and outdated can you get? Certain spellings only look strange and unfamiliar at first. Once you're used to them, it seems strange to see the more old-fashioned transliterations, and that's one reason why I'm really not a fan of the more admittedly conservative transliteration style used by the ISU, the International Skating Union. If you watch skating a lot, you'll see how obviously Russians, thankfully, are kicked out of an international competition currently, but when they were still competing, you would see, for example, the name Yevgenia would look like it was pronounced Evgenia, or the name Yelena looked like it would be pronounced Elena, and just all sorts of other things like that. And when particularly when you're not familiar with Russian, it just looks like it would be pronounced in a much different way. For example, the city near St. Petersburg, where Tsar Nicholas spent most of his life after he got bored of living in St. Petersburg, was Tsarskoye Selo. But the way I saw it originally transliterated, it made me want to pronounce it Tsarsko Selo, and the way I originally saw Ukraine's capital transliterated, it made me want to pronounce it Kiev. And I realize many people now, including my own father, they think that's how the name is pronounced because ignorant newscasters use that pronunciation. It's Kiev, but just again getting kind of off topic. But the way you spell and transliterate a name, it really makes a difference in how people understand how to pronounce it correctly. When I was 16 and majorly getting back into my Russophilia, I developed a rather purist, some might say nitpicky, approach to transliteration. For years, I did letter-for-letter transliteration, and I never translate personal names. I also go one step further, and I used to, at least anyway, use accent marks when I know where the stress falls. Accents aren't normally written outside of dictionaries and language textbooks, but I felt it was a courtesy to provide a pronunciation guide. For example, knowing if O is stressed or unstressed impacts the pronunciation. When the accent falls on O, it's pronounced like an English O. When there's no stress, it's pronounced like a long A, as I explained previously. So, for example, Boris is properly pronounced, as I just said, Boris, not Boris, although obviously I understand some people, for example, Boris Johnson in the UK, that's their name, that's the way they've always been pronouncing it. Of course, I would respect how someone pronounces or chooses to transliterate their own name, but when you're talking about a name that's an actual Russian person and they're not using English rules of pronunciation, just respect the Russian rules of pronunciation, don't impose your own way of saying it on them. When an accent fell on the vowels ye, ya, or you, I did not use accents. Maybe it was hypocritical, but I felt that might give the impression of those being separate letters in Russian instead of one complete vowel, and that would impact the way people might pronounce the names. My style of letter-for-letter transliteration seems to be a much more modern style, whereas some of the alternate styles you might have seen are based on a more old-fashioned approach of perhaps enforcing Anglo norms and expectations on Russian spellings. But for me, as I was just explaining, those older styles don't always give the impression of the true pronunciation. For example, I originally thought Tatiana was pronounced Tatiana because I had only seen the spelling Tatiana. The more accurate Tatiana spelling with a YA suggests the true pronunciation. The letter E is and isn't the same as the English E. It can take the sound we expect of an E, but more often than not, it's a Y sound. For example, Nadezhda is really pronounced the way I just said it, not Nadezhda. When it makes sense, I render the E as Y, so as to avoid pronunciational confusion. For example, why use the spelling Ekaterina when the name is really pronounced Yekaterina? Or again, why have a double E or an E after another vowel? It gave me false pronunciational impressions for a while, like I was just explaining, for example, the imperial town of Tsarskoye Selo. And I also, as I just mentioned, that I thought that anglicized version of the Russified form of Ukraine's capital was pronounced Kiev based on the K-I-E-V spelling. When my non-Ukrainian and non-Ukrainophile characters say the city's name, it's rendered as K-I-Y-E-V. The proper Ukrainian spellings I was just mentioning, it does transliterate as K-Y-Y-I-V, but that just looks confusing even to me, so I go with the preferred transliteration of K-Y-I-V. It's particularly weird to see a double E like in G-O-R-D-E-E-V-A. That obviously some people might know that's a very famous pair skater, Yekaterina Gordieva. Unfortunately, her husband Sergei Grinkov passed away in September of 1995 when he was only 28 years old. But the way she has chosen to transliterate her own name and the way the International Skating Union did it made it look like her name is pronounced Gordieva. Like seriously, again, like the way you choose to spell something, it has an impact, particularly when someone is not familiar with the rules of pronunciation. So you always want to be as accurate as possible. Now you are looking at some Russian names which all end in the same letter, which is translated as a Y from top to bottom. They are Andrei, Alexei, Matvey, Nikolai, and Sergei. Many times these names are transliterated with an I on the end, though the I sound in Russian is represented by, nowadays, a letter. It looks like the backwards N. I'm sure you're familiar with it, and it used to be represented by a letter that did look like the English letter I, and it still is used that way in the Ukrainian alphabet. If they truly ended in the Russian letter I, they would be pronounced differently. For example, Andrei instead of Andrei. It seems rather old-fashioned to render Ya, the final letter of the alphabet, which looks like a backwards R. You probably are all very familiar with that, particularly in the name of the toy store, Toys R Us, as IA. When I see a spelling like D-A-R-I-A-K-A-T-I-A or T-A-T-I-A-N-A, I'm going to want to pronounce the I and A separately, whereas the Ya, Y-A, tells me that's just one vowel. And you're seeing another screenshot of some more Russian male names, which end in the final two letters, and from top to bottom they are Yuri, Lavrenti, Yevgeny, Dmitry, Georgy, Gennady, Vitaly, Vasily, Anatoly. They all end in the letters I, Y. Most people use one or the other letter, since they probably assume a spelling like Y-U-R-I-Y or V-A-S-I-L-I-Y looks too weird to an Anglophone, though both of those vowels are used together for a reason. They'd be pronounced a bit differently if they only ended in one or the other. And frankly, a spelling like V-I-T-A-L-I-Y or L-A-V-R-E-N-T-I-Y looks a lot simpler and more normal than K-Y-Y-I-V. On the same note, many people choose to represent the I-Y-A ending on certain names as just I-A, though I of course choose to use the full letter-by-letter transliteration. Maybe some people think it looks weird, but I don't see anything odd about spellings like M-A-R-A-I-Y-A-A-N-A-S-T-A-S-I-Y-A, K-S-E-N-I-Y-A, K-L-A-V-D-I-Y-A, or L-I-D-I-Y-A. It's just how they're written. Using the Ya after the I tells me how to accurately pronounce the name. A subtle difference is still a difference. Russian does not have a letter X. It uses the letters K and S to represent that sound. For example, A-L-E-K-S-A-N-D-R-A, or K-S-E-N-I-Y-A, not Alexandra or Xenia with the X there. The Cyrillic letter that looks like an X transliterates as KH as in Lach or Hanukkah. Finally, the letter E with an umlaut over it is transliterated as yo, not E or EO. What spelling of the Russian form of Theodore most accurately shows its pronunciation of Fyodor, Fyodor, Fedor, or Feodor, although I do leave it as it is with the umlaut over it, as I was just explaining, when it appears in a surname, like Gorbachova or Likachova. The alternatives look awkward, just like Kiev with two Y's in it. Sometimes it's necessary to go with a simpler transliteration, even if it's not 100% accurate. After 19 years, in July of 2015, I finally stopped using accent marks in all these Russian names. It just started feeling pretentious, unnecessary, and awkward, even by my standards, not to mention slowing down my typing speed. I also began to dislike my inconsistencies, since I never used accents when I wasn't 100% sure where the stress fell, like, for example, the names of Dinara, Arkadia, Rostislav, Leonti, nor for ya, you, ye, or the letter y in names such as Tatiana, Yuri, Yeltsina, Chernomyrdina. I think it started as a way to overcompensate for how badly I transliterated when I was just learning the Russian alphabet at 13. And then over the years, I just justified it as my personal style, my own little quirk, and a courtesy to people who wouldn't know how to pronounce those names and words otherwise. I got used to seeing and writing certain names without vowels, like Konev, Koneva, Malenkov, Malenkova, Lebedev, Lebedeva, and Vsevolod. It was kind of odd to begin writing them with accents. I'm more used to them without than with. Russian isn't like Hungarian, French, or Spanish, where it's normal to encounter accent marks on names, like, for example, Ramon, Kalman, Irene. Accents aren't normally rendered outside of dictionaries and language textbooks. Removing accent marks from my Russian novels did create an unintentional bit of a headache because there were some words in the books that legitimately had accent marks, for example, particularly loanwords from French. So I made up a little list of them in 2015 in the summer when I was finally ridding myself of that habit, so I would know exactly which words I had to do a find search for and put accent marks back in after I stripped them all completely out of the entire manuscripts. And so that wasn't fun, particularly because there were some words I totally forgot about or didn't realize I had used accent marks where they legitimately belonged, but thankfully that eventually finally got all straightened out. If you're interested, this is what my handwriting in Russian Cyrillic looks like. I also made this up. I didn't go through with this, but I was thinking at the time of doing a map in the front matter of my Russian historicals that just places where the characters mention or where they live in mountain ranges, cities, towns, rivers and such like that, but maybe someday we'll do that. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy content like this, please consider subscribing if you haven't already and hitting that notification bell. I really, really like to see comments from you guys. Let me know if you've read a lot of Russian literature, if you're interested in reading some more, and what kind of transliteration style you've been familiar with, or if any of my points raised were new to you, or if you disagreed with them, just let me know so we can have a conversation and I can make friends with more people on BookTube and AuthorTube. And I will see you guys again very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.